Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a follow-up video from my last video that I made, so if you guys haven't checked that out yet, I highly suggest you go and do that. Basically, I showed you guys how to do a knockoff from start to finish and all the little tips and tricks involved with that. This week's video, I'm going to be taking the pattern that I made from that video and I'm going to be showing you guys what I created with it and if it looks at all like the one that I actually knocked it off of. So in that video, I went ahead and copied a men's button-down shirt, and I'm going to be taking that and creating a whole new one. So before I go any further into this video, I wanted to stop and say thank you to myfabricdesigns.com because they actually provided the fabric that I'm using in this video, as well as a discount code for you guys to use. It's good for 3 uses per user, and you can use it all the way up until the end of December 2020. So you have a whole year to be able to use these codes multiple times. So I'm going to put it right here, but also it's going to be down in the description as well, along with their website and everything. So basically, myfabricdesign.com allows you to design custom fabrics. I didn't actually design the fabric that I'm going to be showing you here in a second. I got it from another user that designed it, but they also have prints on there that they've designed as well. And so there's a huge selection of fabrics on there that you can choose from, or if you can't find what you're looking for, you can also design it yourself. So here's the fabric that I actually ended up going with. I don't know if you guys can see that, but I'll give you guys a close-up. But it's basically a dinosaur constellation prints. It's really super cute. It kind of has this like almost stone-washed look in the background. Like it's not just a flat black or gray in the background. It has like a little something to it. I also actually have already washed this fabric, so I haven't cut into it yet. Only washed it, but whenever I was looking at it after it was washed, it didn't look like it faded at all, and there was no bleeding from like the black into the white or anything like that. So I'm very happy with the quality of it.
Enough talk, onto the shirt making. I'm not really sure why this happens to me, but for some reason cutting seems to always take way longer for me to accomplish than just sewing my project itself. Maybe it's because I get neurotic about the grain line and I measure my fabric to make sure that everything is folded perfectly straight on said grain line. I like to think that it's because I focus mostly on lingerie and precise cutting is important, but really I think I'm just neurotic about it and I really need to calm the hell down. So to save you from the boredom of watching this and my sanity in editing all of this footage, we're gonna go ahead and speed this up a bit. So initially, whenever I picked out this fabric, I was not paying attention, and even though I knew that it was a one-way design, I did not realize that it was also printed on the cross grain. Luckily for me, I ordered just enough yardage to cover this project, though I did not have enough left over to hoard many scraps like I usually do. But it is something for you guys to keep in mind whenever you are ordering online. This is probably a no-brainer to many of you, but I honestly did not even think about it. I'm very lucky that in this particular project, the grain line didn't matter whether it was a straight grain or cross grain, and that this fabric did not need to flow in a particular way. So if I had chosen, say, the silk and needed it to be a certain type of flowy skirt, I might have been screwed. So definitely heed my advice and pay attention to these things. After 3 years of cutting out all of my pattern pieces, I went ahead and transferred all of my markings and cut out all of these sewing notches. At this time, I also applied fusible interfacing to both of my collar pieces, my 2 collar stands, as well as the front of my shirt where the placket is going to be. So typically, whenever you are fusing your pattern pieces, there's 2 different ways to do this. There's block fusing and there's hand fusing. So block fusing is whenever you take the pieces that need fusing and you cut them out of a pre-fused piece of fabric. The benefit of block fusing is that if you are working with a fabric that skews easily, you don't have to worry about it warping out of shape before you get a chance to apply the fusing. In a factory setting, this is definitely considered a more cost-effective option in the sense that you are spending less on labor because it is easier than having to match up the pieces and individually fuse each one. Also, because the self and the interfacing are treated as one, you don't need 2 separate patterns, so that also cuts down on the number of pieces that have to be individually cut. So this is a very cost-effective method, but not necessarily a higher-end method. With the hand piecing or hand fusing method, you would want to use 2 separate pattern pieces because the interfacing piece would need to be 1/8 of an inch smaller all the way around. And the reason for this is that by doing it this way, you'll actually have less bulk inside the seams itself. So this way is definitely reserved typically more for mid to high range priced garments, just because you are cutting twice as many pieces, and there is also a need for someone to be hand fusing each piece. And if you've been paying attention, you'll realize I did neither of these methods, or rather a combination of the two, because I'm lazy, and this was a mistake. Well, I'm very happy that I chose to go with the premium cotton option on myfabricdesigns.com. It did make the fabric a slightly more thick, and while I didn't have to worry about it stretching or skewing, the thickness coupled with the thickness of the fusible interfacing meant that I probably should have cut away the interfacing from the seam allowance and done a proper hand fused piece rather than this lazy method of half hand fuse, half block fuse. And here you can see my laziness in full glory. I did cut it the proper width, but obviously not the proper length. I just fused it and then cut off the excess. While there weren't any major repercussions for me choosing to do it this way, it is definitely not recommended, and you'll see later on that I did have some trouble with the collar because of the thickness and the seams. And don't ask me why I'm meticulous with my cutting, but really lazy when it comes to fusing. I don't know the answer to that. Let's move on to sewing. So I'm first starting with my back pieces by connecting my 2 back yokes to my bottom back piece. And you're going to want to sandwich your pieces the way that I'm doing here, with your back yokes right sides together and your back piece sandwiched in between the two. If you're a little confused by this, then just keep watching. You'll see that once it's all sewn up, the 2 back yokes are going to flip up and the wrong sides of the yokes will be together and the seam allowance will be enclosed between the 2 yokes. While sometimes it is possible to just have a single layer for the back yoke, doubling up the back yoke is considered higher quality than just having a single layer, and there's a few reasons for this. So one of the things that I see a lot of the times whenever there's only one layer for the back yoke is that the weight of whatever is sewn to it will actually pull the yoke seam and make it crooked or uneven and create kind of wave lines in that seam. And this happens a lot in dresses, where a lot of companies think that they can get away with not doubling up the yoke because it is such a lightweight fabric, but this happens the most whenever it is a lightweight fabric. Sometimes you can get away with just doing the single layer whenever it's a thicker fabric, but generally when it's thicker, it's not as comfortable, and you don't want to just have a single layer because that seam will usually poke at you a little bit. One of the things I love most about doubling up my back yoke is that it means that I can clean finish both the back yoke seam as well as the shoulder seams. This not only makes it more comfortable because the seam's not directly touching your skin, but it also helps keep the wear and tear of your garment to a minimum. That way it can last you a little bit longer, and it also makes your garment beautiful on the inside as well as the outside. And another huge reason why companies decide to double up on their yoke is for hanger appeal. So say you're trying to sell your garment in a department store and your shirt is all buttoned up and it's hanging on a hanger and it's ready to be sold. So what most companies don't want is for the ugly side of their fabric to be visible to the customer upon first glance. So on printed fabrics, especially like the one that I'm using, you'll see that the underside of the fabric is way different than the fashion side of the fabric. And with shopping in department stores and that sort of thing, first impressions matter, because if a customer just at first glance, it doesn't stand out to them as something positive, then they don't look at it again. While it does cost extra for labor as well as fabric costs, it does elevate your garment just that little bit extra to just give it a little something more. Once mine's sewn up, I'm going to give that seam a good press, and then I'm going to top stitch on the back yoke along that seam line. And this isn't necessary, but since the rest of my garment has some top stitching on it, I decided to go ahead and give this some top stitching as well, just to give it a little something extra. Next up are the shoulder seams. Now, it's a little bit hard to see here because it's black on black, so bear with me. I'm going to try and explain this as best I can. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to fold your inner back yoke piece down and away from your outer back yoke piece. Then you're going to take your 2 front pieces and you're going to pin them at the shoulder to those outer back yoke pieces. So in order to clean finish our shoulder pieces, we're going to do what's called the burrito method. I've only never heard it called the burrito method, so if you guys have another name for it, let me know. But basically, we're going to take our 2 front pieces and our back piece, and we are going to roll them up like a burrito and get them out of the way. Once those are rolled up, you'll see the back yoke piece that we didn't touch, and you're going to take those shoulder seams and you're going to pin them to the shoulder seams that we just pinned pinned a second ago. More than likely, it's going to be a little bit tight at this point, and you're going to just want to be very careful when you're sewing to make sure that you don't accidentally catch any of those rolled up pieces and you're only sewing the shoulder seam. Once our burrito is all sewn up, you can take the rolled up part of the fabric and start pulling it through the armhole. And here you can see exactly why the back yoke is usually a little bit on the wider side and not super narrow, especially whenever you are working with rigid or thick fabrics. It can get really difficult to pull that out, and so just take your time and be careful. That way you don't accidentally rip your stitches or, God forbid, rip your fabric. With your arm workout of the day done, this is what you're going to be left with. It's very wrinkly, so you're definitely going to want to press it, but once it's all pressed up, I'm going to go ahead and top stitch along my shoulder seam. And in hindsight, this would have been a better time to have actually top stitched the back yoke seam, because I would have had just that little bit of extra room to do the turning. Next up are the sleeves, and the reason that I'm not first sewing the underarm seams and the side seams together is because I'm going to be doing a flat felled seam, and it's going to continue from the bottom hem all the way through the sleeve. So because of that, the first thing that I'm going to be doing is actually pinning the sleeve directly to my armhole and matching up all of my notches. If you're wondering how I'm using so few pins, go ahead and check out my sleeve tutorial. Before I learned the method in that tutorial, I used to have such a hard time with sleeves. I would pin them, I would baste them, and I would still end up with puckering no matter what I did. And me not wanting to deal with that at all, I would end up having to rip out the seams constantly. And even after ripping them out and re-sewing them, I would still end up with puckers. So I would end up having like 3 inches of stitching max, and then there would be another 3 inches of stitching, and then another 3 inches of stitching, because even with ripping things out and repinning them, I still couldn't get a single line of stitching to ease all of the fabric in. But a really talented sample maker actually showed me how she sews sleeves, and after that I was hooked. The very first time I tried it, I didn't have any puckering, so definitely check that out if you're like me and consistently struggle with how to ease all of that fabric. Moving on to the placket, I'm first folding under 1/4 inch and pressing, and then I'm folding in the rest of my placket and pressing that as well, and then pinning it down. I'm using a ruler to get my placket perfectly straight. I don't always do this, but for some reason my fusing was not really wanting to crease very well, and I was worried that I wasn't going to catch that 1/4 inch for the clean finish, so I went ahead and used a ruler just to make sure that it was perfectly straight. Then I went ahead and took it over to my sewing machine and sewed that straight line all the way down. Moving on to the collars, as you can see, mine are both the exact same pattern piece. Typically they're not. It's considered lower end for them to be the same pattern piece, but because I was lazy, and also because I'm going to be top stitching this, I was not really that concerned with it rolling out, so I went ahead and just saved myself a little bit of time and just cut 2 of the exact same pattern piece. Once it was pinned together, I sewed 3 of the 4 sides, leaving the side that sews to the neck open. Once it's all sewn up, I gave it a good press, and from here you should press that longest seam to one side and do a stitch, and that is called understitching, but for whatever reason I forgot to do that, so I just went ahead and clipped my 2 corners and turned it right side out and gave it another press. So here you can see exactly why I said that block fusing is not ideal on a thicker fabric with thicker fusing, because I had a lot of difficulty trying to get that little collar point popped out and looking good because of that added bulk in that seam, but I ended up doing it with a seam ripper and it worked out fine, but it was just a little bit more difficult. But once it was done, I went ahead and top stitched around the 3 sewn side. Once it was all sewn up, I sandwiched my collar in between my 2 collar stand pieces with my collar stands right side together. And from here, you can sew all the way around your collar stand, leaving once again that part that sews to the neck open. Here I snipped little triangles of the fabric away from the curved edge. That way, whenever I rolled it back to the right side, there wasn't as much bulk in the seam. Once that's done, I'm folding everything so that right sides are out, giving it a good press, and then I'm going to attach it to the neck hole. So this is once again going to be a little bit difficult to see because it's black on black, but bear with me. We're going to take just 1 layer of our collar stand and we're going to attach it to the neck of our shirt, and we're going to do that with right sides together. So one side of the collar stand won't be pinned at all. So here's a close-up of what that will look like, and once that's all pinned up, you can go ahead and take it over to your sewing machine and just sew along only the side that's pinned. So this step is optional because it's a little bit difficult to do, but it will make the next step a little bit easier to get started. So it's up to you whether or not you want to do it. So I'm going to take my collar stand and fold it to where the right sides are together and the wrong sides are facing out. I'm going to fold my collar down, and then I'm going to fold my placket also out of the way. From here, I'm going to sew my next seam. It's a tight fit, but you only need to sew for about 1 inch. Now I'm clipping the corner to remove some bulk from that seam, and I'm going to flip it right sides out. Now to finish the collar stand, we're going to fold under the seam allowance of the collar stand that's free, and I'm going to enclose all of the seam allowance that we used before into the collar stand, that way you can't see it. And I'm going just a little bit past that stitch line, that way later on whenever we sew it down, you're not going to be able to see that stitch line at all. So just to explain why I sewed up the first 1.5 inches of my collar stand before doing this step, there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is for if you want to wear your shirt open, you have 1 or 2 inches of very clean looking lines inside of your shirt that would be visible to anybody who sees it. Even if your collar stand does not look the best on the inside, those first 1 or 2 inches are going to look really clean and nice. And the second reason is if you're working with a fabric that is difficult for you to fold the seam allowance under, the little bit that you sewed up with your machine earlier is going to help you to roll the rest of it, because your collar stand is a curved piece. So with some fabrics, and if you don't have a lot of experience or whatever, it can sometimes be a little bit tricky. So that definitely helps you as well. But once again, this is 100% preference, and some people find that they get a much better result without doing this. So it's 100% up to you. I do it both ways. It just depends on whatever my mood is at the time. So even though I showed you guys that I was pinning on the inside, I actually had to go back and switch my pins to being on the outside because we're going to be sewing from the outside. And here I am with great intentions to use my stitch in the ditch foot, which would allow me to sew directly into my seam line without visible stitching. However, because of the extra bulk from my fusing, I am not able to do this, and it looks really atrocious. So I actually ended up ripping it out and doing a top stitch on it like I did with my collar and the rest of my shirt, which I like better, or at least that's what I'm telling myself, since it looked like such utter shit. But of course I was so frustrated during the moment that I did not actually record any of that, so just use your imagination. Right before I was gonna sew up my side seam, I realized that my armhole seam was still raw, and even for my lazy heart that will not suffice, so I had to take it over to my serger and overlock the seam allowance. Now I'm working on the flat felled seam for the side seam of my shirt, and I'm doing that from the hem all the way through the underarm seam of the sleeve. And I'm not going to show you all of this. There's a tutorial if you're interested in learning how to do that, but I will say that I wish that I had actually added a little bit more to my seam allowance. I only did 1/2 inch, not thinking, and I should have definitely made it wider. I had to cheat my flat felled seam just a little bit to get it to be as thick as I wanted it to be. It ended up working out fine, but it was more hassle than what it needed to be. Once my side seams and underarm seam was all sewn up, I went ahead and did a clean finish on my sleeve by folding up 1/4 inch and ironing, and then folding it up another inch and ironing that, and then stitching that hem down. For my hem, I chose to do a roll hem just like the original shirt. If you have not seen my roll hem tutorial, go ahead and check that out. It's using a roll hem foot, and it makes it very, very easy and very, very nice looking. For the buttons, I went with these kind of charcoal colored ones that I actually picked up at the flea market for hella cheap, and I actually managed to have some matching ones, so I went ahead and used those. I spent an embarrassing amount of time on trying to figure out what kind of button placement I wanted because my buttons were slightly smaller than the original, and I wasn't sure if it would look dinky if I kept the original placement since the buttons were slightly smaller, or if I should add a button, and blah blah blah. In the end, I ended up pretty much going with the same button placement, and it ended up looking fine. I did also have issues with not being able to find my chalk wheel, which was really annoying, and so made marking the buttonholes especially obnoxious. So I ended up actually just using some thread and just doing some thread markings to figure out where I wanted to put my buttonholes. So I know only a few of you guys are even going to care about this buttonhole, but I find it super satisfying, and so I wanted to show you guys this buttonhole maker. So all you have to do is snap your foot in, plug the little cord into the side of the machine, line up the white notch on the wheel that's on the foot, and then punch in the size of your button into the machine and hit start. Like, that's it. That's the whole thing. I used to despise doing buttonholes because I could never remember how to do them because I did them so rarely, and so I had to like bust out the manual to figure out how to work the buttonhole attachment. And with this buttonhole foot, like, it's so simple that like I don't even care. Like, I don't even mind doing buttons now. It's ridiculous. Once my buttonholes were all sewn and I sliced them open, I realized that the white threads from the underside of the fabric were actually showing through. So I took a black fabric marker and I colored those in, and then I sewed my buttons on. Overall, I'm really happy with the way this shirt turned out. It is draping a little differently, but I think that's mostly due to the fact that this fabric is a little thicker and stiffer than the original, and I'm hoping a few trips through the washing machine will help loosen it up. Before I remake this, I do plan on fixing the back drag lines that's happening underneath the arm, as well as adding a little bit to the sleeve cap so it's not picking up and pointing out quite so much, but I didn't want to make these adjustments before actually seeing it sewn up. Once again, a big thank you to myfabricdesigns.com for providing the fabric for this video. Don't forget to check the description box for a discount code.